Some details of the Viking life. They can amaze even today. Greetings! Today, we're going to talk about the Vikings and what kind of things they actually did. Why sorcerers gave their warriors a potion made of fly agaric. Who is a troll in the Vikings' ideas and for what misdemeanor he could tear out his tongue. Is it true that slave girls were taken into the army to fulfill the needs of the warriors? Be sure to watch the video to the very end to learn about some of the gruesome details of the life of the Scandinavian peoples. Trade is the main key to Viking success. As many of you know, without a successful economy of any state, it is impossible to imagine its prosperity. The same is true for the Vikings. Surely, most of you remember the famous trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Its appearance is directly connected with the Varangians, actually Vikings. After all, such a route began just from Scandinavia and ended in Byzantium. The inhabitants of this country used to be called Greeks. And now pay attention. Every Viking deal was made with just one word. In case of violation of this word or oath, the guilty party was dealt with on the spot, because such a violation was equated with lying and considered one of the main crimes, and liars along with oath-breakers were drowned in the river. Vikings believed that such people, even after death, will experience numerous torments. For the inhabitants of Scandinavia, as for many nationalities, were characterized by customary trades. Vikings hunted wild animals, fished and gathered. But it was trade that became the key occupation for the northern peoples. Numerous battles and battles. When describing the life activities of the Vikings, it is impossible not to mention their conquest campaigns. The art of war eventually became a habitual occupation for the Normans, another name for the Vikings. It is important to note that these warriors had their own approaches to combat and fighting the enemy. First, the Vikings tried to look as fierce as possible to strike terror into the enemy. To do this, they purposefully gnawed the edges of their shields, so the level of fury increased many times over. Secondly, before the battle, warriors took a special potion of fly agaric. This specific potion was prepared by sorcerers. After using this mixture, Vikings stopped feeling pain and fatigue. During the confrontation, such warriors did not spare anyone, and therefore fought to the very end. By the way, such Vikings were called berserk. Separately, it is worth talking about how the Scandinavian warriors directly dealt with ill wishes. Revenge to enemies and offenders for their relatives and loved ones was also peculiar. Vikings took revenge not immediately, but after a certain period. And the waiting time directly affected how the enemy would be defeated. Thus, when the enemy was killed in battle, or under other circumstances, the Viking obligatorily left a cold weapon in the body of the victim, for example, a sword. Such a procedure was considered both a key sign of a warrior who took revenge on the enemy and a symbol that the offense once and for all was washed away with blood. It was also not uncommon for Scandinavian warriors to burn an ill-wisher in his own house. Before setting fire to the dwelling, women, children and old people were taken out of it, because to kill those who a priori are not able to resist the courageous warriors was considered unworthy of the honor of a true Viking. Often future victims were given a chance to correct themselves. For this purpose, the offender could go to the mountains for a month together with his father and eldest son. After himself, the guilty left a pledge in the form of property, which after redemption could go to the family members of the killed or offended Viking. And only in case of refusal of the latter, the guilty person was sentenced to death. Moral principles of the peoples of Scandinavia. Separately, it is worth talking about what ideas about morality had Vikings and what traditions they performed from generation to generation. Moral principles are also included in the list of peculiar norms of behavior of northern peoples. The first thing to pay attention to is the ideas about the unhappiness of their kin. Vikings never discussed the predicament of those around them until one of them asked for help. It was only after the unfortunate person asked for help that they were helped. If there were no requests, the Vikings stayed away and did not interfere in other people's lives. If on the way of Vikings appeared irascible and people with low stress resistance, they did not quarrel with them. In the Scandinavian peoples, irascibility was considered an unworthy phenomenon, and therefore many tried to avoid them. Have you ever heard of trolls? Well, in the Vikings' ideas, such creatures also took place, and they, according to Viking beliefs, appeared to mockers. And yes, mockery was also not welcomed among the peoples of Scandinavia. The Vikings believed that if a person mocked a stranger, a troll would soon come for the mockers. He would just tear out the offender's tongue. Representations of the Vikings about death and the afterlife. Surprisingly, but the most worthy and honourable death among the peoples of Scandinavia was considered after fighting with enemies. And just natural death, from old age, was considered unworthy of honour. And it was the Vikings who died in front of their family members asked the latter to make a ritual murder. An elderly or terminally ill person was first surrounded on all sides with firewood. Then, someone who was not related to the victim of the ritual was summoned. He, armed with a ritual knife, would kill the person. Then the body, surrounded by firewood, was set on fire. After burning, the bones of the deceased were collected to be buried in the ground. Death in Viking ideas was considered not the end, but the continuation of life's journey. However, in a special place, Odin's castle. The property of the deceased Viking was divided into 3 parts. The first remained with relatives and friends, the second was the basis for a feast, and the third became a garment for the deceased. A Viking fallen in battle was often buried with a pet, a dog or a horse, or with a concubine who sought to share the life of the beloved man after his death. The spouse also had the right to do so. The Viking afterlife was always associated with 2 realms, Valhalla and Helheim. In the first fell in battle, men warriors, and in the latter, women. In fact, these are 2 paradises in which the souls of the dead, no one and nothing disturbed. Procreation. Wow, the appearance of children was also considered a special ritual among the Vikings. The newborn was necessarily laid indoors on the ground. None of the surrounding people had the right to touch the baby. The decision to keep the child in the family or not was made solely by the birth father. The positive outcome was influenced by both dreams and predictions of the Scandinavian Magi. Once the child was left once and for all, he was taken in his arms and doused with water. Such a procedure was called to give a name. Slaves in the Vikings. Slavery in Scandinavia was considered one of the solutions to improve the material situation. Therefore, the Vikings treated slaves with special attention. Men who were enslaved did mostly heavy labour, and slave girls performed women's duties, even to the point of going on campaigns to fulfill the needs of the army. Beautiful girls were chosen for this purpose. By the way, the fate of each slave who had no rights depended on the decision of his master. The latter could even allow marriage, although it was not considered a family. The entire subsequent generation was also considered a slave generation. Finally, death at the hands of a slave was considered shameful for the Vikings. Conclusion. Thus, the Vikings are considered one of the most amazing and gloomy peoples living in Scandinavia. Their customs and traditions can surprise even a modern person. Nevertheless, the Vikings entered history as courageous warriors who brought fear and terror to their enemies.